All right, we're back.
Back to the map room. So last week we talked about the human migration map.
Yeah, of the human species, basically.
Of the human species, of Homo sapiens.
Yeah. So that was a corner map for a main feature map I did.
Which is a new map here called Old Kin and Humankind.
Right. And it's supposed to be a way to satisfy people's interest in race, but it also flips race because like a lot of people will see this as like mapping out the kind of key areas or origins of different human races.
So this is kind of a follow-up map to the constellation one we've talked about in a previous episode.
Right. Yeah,
which is in your core graphical depictions map.
Right. So it actually has the same theme.
Has the same theme, but this one you mapped it in a little more detail.
Yeah, and this is like, remember last time you were like looking forward to seeing actual profiles of how it all worked?
Yeah.
Because like it was, last time it was very abstract, it was setting the foundation for people to understand what we're trying to do here. We're flipping race. Well, human species is a spectrum, and everyone is part of that spectrum. Like you can't just say French people are this race because they have all of these genetic markers from these different points in history, from early human migrations to late contributing factors.
So what would make Frenchness, quote unquote, would be that particular mix of all of these different admixtures and ancestries.
And each individual is different. But if you do in geography, we use the word population very differently. Like a population is a sample, right?
Which would be these different unique profiles you have.
Yeah, these are population averages.
Yeah.
So these are population averages. Obviously, the data is not that great. Like in the real world, there's not enough data out there to produce something like this. But let's say there was the funding sources to do this, where they said, hey, we're going to try to do 10%, or I don't know, maybe even 1% is quite radical. 1% of the French population, randomly sample them, and let's produce a genetic profile of that population, that 1%. To represent our whole thing. And each individual might be different. Like there might be one person who has a lot of contributions from this one area, another person would be here, but on average, what would it look like? And that's what these profiles are.
Right. Which is actually going to be the topic of our next video.
So we'll do that next time.
And that's going to be really fascinating.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
But today, we're going to talk about the
corner map. The opposite corner map. So the first corner map was about the human species migration that are probably like foundations of human population differences. This one is going to show how in the last 500 or so years, all of that radically changed. Like humans have been migrating for millennia, right? We know this. But the amount of extermination and kind of disruption that happened in the last 500 years has really changed the makeup of the way humans look across the world, right? And so this one is to map the age of exploration, or basically the early modern era to the current modern era, to show how those established populations and those established kind of genetic markers in those areas, how they got affected by the new era. So, but one thing to note is this is for Altera. And Altera is not a utopic vision, but in my vision to try to include a lot of diversity in the world, that's the main goal. It ultimately has some utopic strands. And in this case here, there's less genocide, less mass violence, less replacement. A real world map would look way worse than this.
Yeah. So, I mean, what you're talking about right now, for example, is the shading of the continents.
Yeah.
So you came up with a 3-color scheme.
Yeah.
Kind of where you have a beige background, a light gray background, and then a darker gray. And those colors represent the amount of replacement that's happened in those areas in the last couple hundred years.
Yeah.
And so the beige areas represent an area where you have less than 30% replacement.
Yeah.
Whereas the dark gray ones represent an area where you have 90% replacement.
Yeah, 90 to 100 basically.
And so, I mean, in Altera, the Americas or the Gemini in Altera are the continents or the land masses which are subject to most replacement, whereas the rest of the world has a very low replacement rate.
Yeah.
And
as in our world.
Yeah. So I mean, the difference, I guess, in our world would be the Americas would be much more gray.
It would be completely.
It would be completely.
Except for like Bolivia, Peru.
Yeah.
and southern Mexico,
Mm-hmm.
you would not.
And I guess Australia as well.
Yeah, Australia. Mm. Australia was extreme, and southern Africa.
Mm-hmm.
You can see if we look closer into, like, let's say southern Africa here, you can see, like, I try to do a little justice to, like, the kind of population. What do you call those? Like enclaves of, like, Europeans. So you can see, like, this brown color is 60%.
Mm-hmm. So that's Cape Town and I guess the Bowers,
like the coast, and then Dutch. This is the Highveld.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but 60%. It doesn't mean that this is majority white. Like 60% replacement just means that, like, for example,
replacements from anywhere. So it could be.
Well, no. Like, so,
or is it mainly European replacement?
Well, actually, it just so happens the majority of the action is being done by Europeans, but that's not the point. The point is to show radical genetic differences. So let's say, like, the Mefficane, the Great Mefficane, or basically the Great Zulu expansion in southern Africa that killed a lot of people. That wouldn't make it onto this map per se, because it's like it's quite similar people. So, like, the actual overall genetic picture of that area hasn't changed. What I'm trying to map in this thing is to show, like, a very radical shift from like a kind of this kind of one part of the spectrum, the human species, going to the other, like swinging to this other side.
Okay.
Right. So
I guess here in your map, those areas which are colored gray are ones that actually being a topic of potential massacre or of potential replacement. So I guess you would imagine the points that you've identified to be near those areas of replacement. Yeah,
it could be. The light gray, like let's say 30% replaced, would probably map very well to the main colonial areas. As you go more interior, that colonial effect might fade so that it's no longer part of the 30%, right? The effects of, like, inland Angola versus coastal Angola are quite drastically different.
Yeah, because I'm actually curious. So, I mean, if we just take a step back.
Yeah.
On the left side, you have human migrations across history.
Yeah.
And in this one, you have within the last couple hundred years. So what's the purpose of this map?
So I could have done another human migration one to satisfy that itch of, like, the age of exploration, like, where did the Portuguese go? Where did the British go? All that kind of stuff. I might actually still do that for Altera as, like, another series. But I thought it'd be really cool for this to show that on the flip side of that, the other side of the coin of all, those kind of maps that show settlement, where Europeans went, where Asian people went, where all that stuff, is to show the effects of what happened when those people went there, right? Every time someone went to wherever they went, there was a reaction, and to map out that reaction. The people responsible for these consequences, it happens to be mostly European colonists. It just so happens that they're mostly Europeans. But in some cases, the reason why, let's say, the Dzungar massacres don't happen in China, where the Chinese massacre a bunch of, like, Mongolic peoples during the Qing dynasty, it doesn't happen in my world because that history doesn't happen. So, like, if you look at the grand list of genocides, it really is mostly represented by Europeans. But it's not to say I'm trying to say only Europeans are capable of this. And I try to get, a diversity. I don't know if I'm supposed to get diversity points for people committing genocide or, like, mass atrocities. But it just so happens that in the last 500 years, that kind of, like, colonial expansion in the last 500 years was mostly spearheaded by peoples from Western Europe and Russia.
And so, for example, yes, here you have around your Black Sea in Altera, and I guess Mongolia and like the strip, I guess, from Eastern
or
Europe.
Northeast Manchuria.
Up to the border of what does that represent?
The Yasak. Yasak means tribute.
Yeah.
So Yasak is actually they basically had a mafia scheme. The Siberian expansion was fur oriented, but unlike the Hudson Bay Company, the way that the Russian expansion happened is they made people their vassals, and the Cossacks as well as fur collectors were allowed to raise and, like, obliterate people for not meeting quotas. So it was basically like a mafia scheme, like the way they did. So in some areas, people were able to meet those quotas and survive, but other areas there was really high amounts of violence, really, really high amounts of violence done.
Just little parentheses.
Yeah.
Dude, I had never thought of the Hudson Bay expansion
Yeah.
in Canada have a parallel with the expansion of Russia into Siberia.
Oh yeah, it happened.
Like it just blew my mind right now because I had never seen the parallel, but right now it makes total sense.
But you know where they met? The two competitors met in where we are.
Yeah, I know.
Northwest. That's where it met.
So what about the green, which you have as nullius in the legend?
Yeah, nullius. It's just a kind of allusion to terra nullius. It was a kind of like international relations principle, like early international relations principle that was used from the beginning of when the Portuguese first started mapping West Africa. Basically, it was the idea that you could claim unclaimed lands or unsettled lands. The funny thing is, Europeans had a very interesting interpretation of this. In the 1500s, they started thinking that unsettled, unpeopled meant non-Christian. And the very first instance of this being legally interpreted was when Pope Urban, is that a name? Pope Urban, whatever?
Yeah.
That was one of the popes, right? He gave official sanction for the extermination of the Guanches. So the first act of European expansion in the Age of Exploration was the Canary Islands. That was ground zero. And that was the extermination of a people who were actually not connected to the mainland. They just basically didn't have the same technology capabilities as like North Africans. So the Spanish and Portuguese were very used to fighting North Africans, but they weren't used to fighting these peoples isolated from the mainland who had like slingshots, javelins and stuff. The way they interpreted their way of conquering this land, it just led to basically the complete extermination of the population. You know, a lot of Canary Islanders will say just like it runs in their blood, Canary, like the indigenous peoples, but it's minute. It's like, it was almost, you could classify it as genocide. In this world, in Altera, the Guanches exist in Madeira. Madeira was never settled in real life until the Portuguese went. But in my world, I needed that example of that Age of Exploration act. So I put it in Madeira, whereas the Canary Islanders remain a population, but they just speak a very divergent Berber dialect. Because we don't know actually what we don't have a lot of recordings of their words, but we know it was a Berber language, a Tamazic language. We just don't know what it was. So I just invented this history of like a migration from, you know, Morocco, where this one branch of the northern Tamazic languages makes it onto the Canary Islands. But anyways, the point is, in Madeira, I still need an example of that Age of Exploration moment, and I call it the Guanches nullification. Nullification is cognate to nullius. And nullification, to be nullified, is kind of a very kind of scary word. It just means to be exterminated, right? So it's cool to connect this idea of terra nullius and nullification. Terra nullius, the idea of settling unclaimed lands, to the disappearing of the peoples on those lands that were not unclaimed, but in fact were settled.
It's almost a foresight, right?
Yeah, it's very ironic because like
it's almost a foresight because, I mean, even if you had areas in the world that were uninhabited by humans, you had areas of the world which were very much inhabited, but were still called terra nullius.
Yeah, and by claiming that, you nullify them.
Exactly.
Nullification.
And from the start, nobody has ever lived here. And so in your mindset, you create this whole culture of creating something from nothing.
And just conquest. Yeah. Also the new world. And like, we're here to find new lives,
which is absolutely abhorrent.
Yeah, it's a narrative, right? It's a narrative that we live in today,
which we live in, and it's so difficult to navigate because unfortunately a lot of elders share these points of view. Yeah.
Anyway, so that's that. So actually, you can't really see it too well, but you know the map. It's colored. It's colored 90%.
And so, by the way, just in terms of legends, here you have three symbols. So you have decimation, annihilation, and isolation.
Yeah, annihilation is basically near. So you could say decimation is genocide, but not complete. The Jews were not exterminated in the Holocaust. High rates of death, abhorrent, but it was not like. For example, even though that the amount of Jewish people in Europe is quite low compared to before, they're still there.
So it was an attempt at genocide. Unsuccessful.
Almost successful. But But in our world, there are cases where annihilation really did happen.
Such a Biltuk.
Yeah, the Beothuk or Guanches, like, right? Like, so there are actual cases that...
And so those ones you represent with annihilation, yes.
Yeah. So decimation would be stuff like, Trail of Tears, the killing times. This is such a scary word title. Like, I can't believe that in Australia, that, like, Australian Aboriginals characterize that colonial era, like the 300 to 200 years of their colonial history as the killing times. It's really telling of, like, what Aboriginal life meant in those eras, that you could just be killed and there were no repercussions. Like, if you think, like, the whole Black Lives Matters movement, like, think of that and what they're responding to, this was, like, really shocking. Like, just imagine that, but, like, imagine a way different society for 200 years, and you can now understand why Australia, like,
I mean, we were talking, for example, about Indigenous issues in Canada.
Yeah.
And how these days this issue right now is on the forefront. The bodies of the children they found in Kamloops.
Yeah.
And the language sounds very close. For example, I was shocked. I was reading about this a couple days ago. And one of the Indian Affairs, quote unquote, agents, Campbell Scott, talks about in his language, and it's quoted, he talks about the final solution to the Indian problem.
Yeah.
And this is in 1911.
Yeah.
He's talking
way
about
before
this.
the Holocaust. Yeah.
And so you see that this is something which was planned.
It's in their mindset. And it's in the range of possibilities.
It's in the range and then it seeps into culture.
Yeah.
And that is what is most troubling.
Yeah.
Is where you have a culture of people that deem themselves nice, quote unquote, or friendly or open-minded, but that have a very, very dark past that they have a very hard time looking into.
Yeah.
And that is very chilling to think about.
Yeah. And also the fact that, like, for example, a mass grave of these children, there's no way to, like, sugarcoat it. Like, no matter how you defend it, it's like they were so devalued that they didn't get proper burials, didn't get proper record keeping. Mm-hmm. There was no... what do you call it?
Well, no, I mean, that is the thing.
Oh, the records were destroyed?
That is the thing, is that essentially the chilling nature of the bureaucracy of the time produced those records. So those records exist.
Right.
And essentially the Indian agent played the role as the Gestapo.
Yeah.
And the church, the Gestapo, and the church played the role of the enforcing entity.
Yeah.
So the church has kept those records.
Yeah.
It is just they are now inaccessible because of the Privacy Act of Canada. Right. So now these people are shielding themselves behind the legal arm of the Canadian government.
Right. The accountability thing, the lives are so devalued that their deaths don't make it into the news. People don't need to care. They don't even know, like, back in the day, right?
Yeah.
Anyway, so we don't need to get there, but the point is this kind of stuff happened all around the world, and that's the flip side to this whole kind of migration map that people are obsessed with, where my social studies textbooks still showed, like, Portuguese colonial empire, French colonial empire. Where did the French expand, in the Americas, from lower Canada and upper Canada to, the Mississippi Valley? Where did they go?
It's a very fetishized way of looking at the world.
Yeah. Where did they go? Where did they, where did they claim? What were their territorial claims? Like, why are those the maps that we're looking at in social studies, right? So, like, it would be actually cool to produce a map like this, but for the real world, right? Yeah. But anyways, the point is, though, I tried to do this based on some data, but also based on, like, some creative license, and it also reflects the lore. So this is not going to be representative of the real world, but has some similarities, okay? So we've already talked about the colors, and we talked about the symbols, the three things, decimation, annihilation, and the third one I just thought was interesting to put in because it's kind of like, it's not a happy note, but it's also part of the picture of disruption, which is that because of this kind of, like, drastic kind of, like, end of the world catastrophe that's happening all around certain peoples, they decide to isolate themselves. They decide to go away and, not, like, if they have contact, it's minimal. So they try to filter their contact or have a buffer, right? And so there's, like, peoples like this all around the world, case studies of this, right? Like, the most interesting things is, like, some of the places that you think of as being, like, the oldest civilization centers have some of the oldest examples of prolonged isolated peoples who choose to. And, these are called the Veddas, okay? The Wanya Leto peoples. I think that means forest dwellers. I'm not sure if it means forest dwellers in Tamil or Sinhalese, but the Vedda is what the Sinhalese would call them, right? And so from the earliest records of ancient Sri Lanka, there are references to people who choose to remain as hunter-gatherers in the inland forest and the mountain forest. There are still peoples today who still practice the silent trade in the Himalayas. Do you know what the silent trade is?
Silent trade?
Yeah, silent trade. Silent trade usually happens when you have a settled people and hunter-gatherer people who interact, but they don't interact very often. So, for example, the Mihak people, they speak a language isolate. They're also called the Kusunda. They'll go to these farmers in the valleys and they'll leave like honey. And then the next day they come back and they expect arrowheads or something. They expect something, but they don't do any kind of like prolonged interaction. It's just I leave something here, like a deer hoof, and you give me something, right? So they've done this for centuries. And it's not that, they can't do what the other person does. They just choose to do this. So in some of the most settled and civil, like what would be historically cliche term civilized areas in the world, there are peoples who have chose to not be part of those worlds. So India is a very interesting example of having so many of these people living side by side with these like huge tax collecting empires and city states. It's just the diversity of human culture and choice is so interesting in India. Anyway, so that's one example. And I invented this one, the Nahala people. So Papua gets Indianized, like culturally, but their languages are still Papuan, all the different Papuan languages. But I'm saying here that there will be still people like the Dani who choose to not be part of that, just like the Vedas. And, you could still imagine a 1930s discovery of an isolated tribe. What is actually really fascinating about this, though, is that the Papuan isolated peoples that were discovered in the 1930s, they were farmers, and they were in the tens of thousands in population. That's how remote these mountain plateaus are. These farmers, not hunter-gatherers, these farmers, so big populations, remain isolated from all their surrounding peoples and from Europeans for the 1930s. Anyway, so there's all these isolated people around the world.
Wow.
The Bajau we've talked about in other videos. Such fascinating people, right? And, of course, they do more contact and trade with the surrounding peoples. But there's still people who choose to live isolated from the others. And obviously, I can't represent everyone who chooses that isolated kind of way, but I'm trying to showcase an example, like a good kind of cluster of them. And so, like you can see here in the Amazon or the Xingu, I'm not able to show, like, it's just too much. Like, the most amount of isolated but also uncontacted tribes in the world still remains in the Amazon, and I just call them the 100 tribes, right? So you could really imagine bureaucrats using that term, but it's not something that I'm trying to say is supposed to be how you should call them, but you can see this term being used as an epithet. But yeah, so that's what I included those just to show you that in response to these things, some people will do this.
And so I'm just curious, you have, for example, text that goes with these different events?
Yeah.
And descriptions?
Yeah.
That people can look up? Apart from that one, the Nahala people?
Yeah.
All the other ones people can actually search up.
Yeah, so the thing is, I used allusions and references so that they'll find something. So, for example, here, the Warakari massacres refers to the Moriori Genocide. The Moriori Genocide was, actually, this is one of the only non-European ones to make it on the map. During the Maori Wars, the Musket Wars in the late 1800s, a people from West North Island, Aotearoa, a tribe called the Warakari, they went to the Chatham Islands, which are an isolated island that actually had a pacifist culture. They actually, when they were on the brink of destruction, okay, in the last moments of their genocide, they met and asked each other, should we take up arms? And they still said no. Wow. They had a pacifist culture that said no war, no violence, that kind of stuff. Because they were such a small island in such like harsh conditions, they decided to abandon that. And anyway, so they fell prey to this this one tribe, and this one tribe just in two events, they arrived 2 times, completely wiped them out. Like, such decimation. Anyways, so if you search up this, you'll find the tribe's name and you'll find them linked to the Moriori. I didn't call it the Moriori Genocide because the Moriori still survive in Altera in Chatham. It's this Caledonia island, this alt-geo, so I created this island myself. It's supposed to be an enlarged Lorde Howe Island. I'm just very fascinated by Lorde Howe Island because it's so isolated that its faunal and flora makeup is very divergent. It has a lot of cool stuff. If it was a larger island that looked kind of like the coast of Dalmatia of Croatia, it'd be pretty epic to visit. But anyways, this is supposed to be kind of like where the Papuan, the South Seas plantation historical narrative takes place in Altera. Mm-hmm. And to make room for that, I have that massacre happened here. First of all, as a case study, but also that affects no one in real life because the original inhabitants of this island, I'm not making up. That's the kind of creative license I'm doing. I'm saying that the native people here, we have no analog to in the real world. And, I don't have to make up their culture because they get wiped out. It's sad. I'm not trying to advertise, mass atrocities, but I'm just saying I've moved one mass atrocity that actually has a real world analog and I've moved it to somewhere where it's just fictional. And yeah, so if they search it up, they'll find that. The Pintubi tribe are one of the last peoples to be uncontacted in Australia in the 20th century, early 1900s. They walked out of the desert and met Europeans for the first time. The Tugi tribe is just one of the Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples that I found as a name and reference for. In real life, there are no 100% descendant survivors. Most of them, the people who claim to be parts of these various tribes in Tasmania, they have a lot of European ancestry, and they're trying to revitalize their culture, the culture of their ancestors. But you can still say a successful genocide happened in Tasmania. Anyway, so I say that after the genocide happens, one tribe, let's say, gets away, and they're hiding in the Tarkine forest. That's kind of lore I have. And it's actually kind of interesting because the Tasmanian tiger in my world does not get exterminated. So instead of Tasmanian tiger sightings in Tasmania, or it's called Cantabria, I'm just saying the analog of these kind of sightings would be the Tugi tribe people. Yeah, the Kalanoro clearances, that's something I made up completely because Siluria is made up. The Bajau people, actually, we were just talking about it. They have a cognate in Madagascar. Mm. The fishing folk of southwest Madagascar are called the Vezo. Mm. Vezo is completely cognate to Bajau. So the B and V you can see, Spanish, B and Cuba. The B and V are merging or being supplanted. Mm. So B and V, and then AU and O. And then J and Z, J and Z, that's easy. So Bajau, Vezo, they're the same word. They mean fishing folk, or people who are tied, who are reliant upon fish, is actually what it describes to. I wanted to use them as the people who get wiped out, but they're real people, so I don't want it. I didn't want that. So I used another term. Kalanoro is a Malagasy word for forest peoples that are mythical. They have it in their lore that the forest people of their island disappeared when the forest was taken. Is that cool? Mm. They said that once they started cutting down the trees, these Kalanoro people started disappearing. Mm. So kind of like in Iceland, the Malagasy, when they settled this, they had to invent an other. In Iceland, they invented elves and the interaction between humans and elves to kind of show that kind of conquest thing. Here's the same thing. When we arrived, these people disappeared. There's no evidence of earlier inhabitants than the Malagasy. So the Malagasy invented this whole lore of people disappearing because they arrived. Mm. That's kind of interesting, right?
Yeah. I mean, little parentheses. I don't know if this is worth going in the episode, but you said Madagascar.
Yeah.
It's first populated by Austronesian peoples. Yeah. Yet Madagascar is so close to the African continent.
Yeah.
So who would say that you wouldn't have an ancestral population?
Yeah.
Which would, for example, have ancestry to the
continent.
Or the continent.
Yeah.
Which were there, yet not, recorded in the way we usually do.
Well, the thing is, they have no archaeological findings. Yeah. Once they find it, we'll be able to...
Exactly.
But Yeah, for sure. Like, and actually, it's been recorded that when the Malagasy started arriving, probably just like a couple, right after them, the Bantu expansion reached Madagascar. People started arriving on the other side.
Mm.
And it's really cool. You should look at how I have that genetic profile thing. They started doing studies in Madagascar. It's fascinating. The Malagasy Highland so all along the west coast. It's majority has shared genetic ancestry with Southern Africa. This highland area.
But when you go in the highland, it's very Austronesian.
Almost like 80%.
Wow.
It's fascinating. Like there are very Asian-looking people in Madagascar, but they live in the highlands. Right? There's a spectrum.
Yeah.
A spectrum in Madagascar. It's just fascinating.
Yeah. It's hard to look at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Because it just shows how. But I think it's good that you have it in this map because we're talking about genetics, we're talking about human migration.
Yeah, and population.
Talking about race admixture.
Yeah.
And it's part of the world we live in.
Yeah.
In which, a lot of areas in our current world have been replaced.
Radically replaced.
Yeah. And it's important to know that has happened.
Yeah.
That has happened.
So, for example, America is probably what looks closest to real life, right? Whereas, like, you can see there's a lot of whites in northern and...
Yeah, so here, white means no population replacement. So in your world, or minimum, or less than 30%. Yeah. So in your world, the plains and the Pacific Northwest and the Arctic has received minimal...
Yeah. Just like, Western Amazon or, Xingu and the Andes. Mm-hmm. Actually, in our real world, it's actually like for someone who wants to really experience being totally immersed in a it's not to say it's not a colonial context, but in a non-settler dominated demographic context, go to Bolivia. You will be surrounded by people who you never gave a thought to. Okay, like, you never even thought these people, you never thought about them, okay? Because there's so much erasure in the colonial context of the Americas. You go to Bolivia, you'll be reminded this is what it used to look like. Like, Bolivia is majority mestizo and indigenous, but even the mestizo, they're quite indigenous in their ancestry. And it just shows you the resilience of these like highly populated areas of the Americas that, after all these atrocities, near genocidal campaign actually Bolivia, where, I told you about the Potosi mine and how people had to maim their children to prevent them from being taken to those mines. So, and the fact that this country still comes out as like majority, like it's still colonial, they're still dealing with their colonial context, but demographically, it's just, yeah. Anyway, okay, so that's done.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a wrap for this one.
Yeah. Core note to end on, but that's it is what it is.
It is. I mean, it's especially today. It's very important to recognize this because I mean, at least I can't talk for the whole of the world, but at least in the Pacific Northwest, in Canada, there's a little space that has been created to assert for Indigenous rights.
Yeah.
And now is the time.
Yeah. Yeah, now's
to
the time
build
to be
on
in this kind of stuff.
Well, I mean, to be interested, but also to build on the work that a lot of people have been doing.
Yeah.
In the last couple decades.
Yeah.
And
All right. All right.
All right.